Hello, welcome everybody. Um, I'm Shep Steiner and welcome to the conference series Relative Time, Little Time. I'm Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Theory at the University of Manitoba and editor of the journal Mosaic. I want to welcome you to the lecture series Relative Time, Little Time that the Dutch artist team Vic van der Pol developed in collaboration with our journal. Before I thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Manitoba campuses are located, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you to our sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the University of Manitoba Conference Sponsorship Program, and lastly, the Faculty of Arts, the School of Art, and the Institute for the Humanities, all at the University of Manitoba. As for questions to our speaker, please refrain from interjecting until the end of the lecture and realize you will be recorded. Your consent is appreciated. My co-host, Carolyn DeCorno, Mosaic's managing editor, will unmute everyone at the end of the talk for questions. If you can ask your questions with cameras on, that is appreciated, and also maybe raise your Zoom hand. Lastly, I remind you that our next lecture is Friday at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time with the feminist philosopher from the University of Toulouse, Dr. Elsa Dorlin. Now to welcome our invited speaker, Dr. Paul Heubener. He's Associate Professor of English in the Center for Humanities at the Athabasca University. His research focuses on time and its relation to power, most recently, the intersection of time and sleep. One recent essay titled Stealing Sleep, and the title of his essay today, Sleep Through This Talk, reminds me of the mimetic relationship urged upon viewers by Vic van der Pol's Sleep With Me from the 90s. An iterative film installation that involves the rescreening of Andy Warhol's 1964 film Sleep, the pillows and blankets in the gallery provided. In any case, Heubener's books, which are many, include Nature's Broken Clocks, Reimagining Time in the Face of the Environmental Crisis from 2020, and Timing Canada, The Shifting Politics of Time in Canadian Literary Culture from 2015. Finally, in 2017, with Susie O'Brien, Tony Porter, Liam Stockdale, and Yankee Rachel Zhu, Heubener co-edited the books Time and Globalization, an Interdisciplinary Dialogue, and secondly, Time, Globalization, and Human Experience. His lectures today is again titled Sleep Through This Talk, Imagination and the Paradox of Sleep in a Restless World. Please welcome Dr. Paul Heubener.
Thank you so much, Shep. That's very kind. I'm just going to put my slides on the screen. Has that come up for everybody? Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shep. And thanks to Vic van der Pol and Carolyn, Sabrina, Pew, and Timothy, and everyone at Mosaic and at the University of Manitoba who's been putting these events together. I'm really grateful for the invitation. And thank you everyone who's here for coming today. I work at Athabasca University on Treaty 6 territory. And I'm fortunate to be on sabbatical right now. And I'm coming to you today from Vancouver, on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stalo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I want to note that certain parts of my talk will raise the matter of residential schools and other topics that may be distressing. The critical study of time, I think, is a really incredible area to work in. It teaches us so much about how we live and think and imagine, and it sheds light on really crucial forms of inequity and power. Studies of time, though, usually tend to focus on waking life, on things like acceleration, technology, and work. But what about those other hours of the clock, the ones we are not awake for? Supposedly, we spend a third of our time sleeping or trying to sleep. So the critical study of time requires us to engage thoughtfully with how we approach sleep, both as an act and as a site of meaning. And I'd like you all right now to open up your chat box on the screen. And I'd like you to describe the sleep you had last night using just one word. You don't have to overthink it. Think of one word to describe the sleep you had last night. And if you're willing, type it in the chat box. A couple of good sleepers and a couple of bad sleepers. Fragmented, bad, exclamation mark, difficult, cold. I'm sorry to hear that. Broken, difficult, quick. That's an interesting one. Quick. Fitful, flaxen, short, a long one, a good one. Thank you, everybody. We could talk a lot about those little responses there. I mean, there's so much going on. Sleep and lack of sleep is a really enormous quandary and an enormous preoccupation. The sleep industry has been valued at over $30 billion US, and that doesn't even include pharmaceuticals. And that valuation was before the pandemic. And I'm sure as many of you know or have experienced, COVID has created even more chaos when it comes to disrupted sleep, insomnia, and inequitable sleep. So yes, sleep is a universal act, everybody does it, but it's very much tied up in matters of culture and power. As Jonathan Crary observes in his book 24/7, sleep, of course, has a dense history, as does anything presumed to be natural. I'd like to offer a slightly longer exercise for you now. You don't have to use the chat box for this, but think of the last time you had a really great sleep. Just take a moment now to think of that great sleep. What were the factors that allowed that sleep to happen? Take a moment to consider. And finally, how might you trace the history and values of your cultural world by considering the conditions of that sleep? A person could spend a career trying to answer this question, but take a moment right now to think about some of the directions this question might lead you. I'm phrasing the question in a positive way here, asking you to think about a really good sleep. But as we saw in the little chat box exercise, we could ask the same question about a time when you did not sleep well. And we could start asking about the sleep of other people. And incidentally, if you couldn't think of a time when you slept well, there may be some systemic factors at work there, but you also might actually get some real benefit from a self-help book or from cognitive behavioral therapy. Those things might not be able to solve the cultural factors behind sleep loss, but they still can be quite helpful. In any case, I'm hoping that If you keep your responses to this exercise in mind, some of you might be willing to share your responses during our discussion time later on. When we think about these kinds of questions, we're starting to engage in critical sleep studies. Critical sleep studies is an emerging field that challenges us to re-examine how we conceive of sleep and how we might confront the cultural forces through which our inequitable encounters with sleep take shape. Scholars such as Sarah Arbour, Benjamin Rees, and Hilary Hines have often found that sleep is heavily infused with politics and inequities. Cultural visions of sleep not only reflect diverse approaches to the literal practice of sleeping, they can also reflect and shape competing forms of value and power, such as those associated with the culture of overwork and social acceleration. And these are among the concerns that are motivating my work right now. My talk today is titled Sleep Through This Talk, and I've used this title for two reasons. The first is that even though I don't know many of you personally, I can guess that many of you probably need more sleep. Most adults in Canada report trouble sleeping, and the same is true in many places. Sleep troubles are often portrayed as an individual matter, but they also emerge from some of these systemic factors to do with overwork, stress, gendered labor, and incomplete social safety nets. So if the best way for you to spend the next hour is to sleep, there's no judgment here. As a sleep studies scholar, maybe the best thing I can do for you is to tell you that it's okay to sleep, and that you don't need to feel guilty about it, and you don't need to try to use it for some goal-oriented reason like increasing your afternoon productivity. You can just let sleep be sleep. Your camera is turned off except for Shep. Sorry, Shep. But for the rest of you, nobody will ever know. The second reason I've used this title is one that will be more relevant for those of you who decide to stay awake. You probably noticed that the title, Sleep Through This Talk, perhaps involves a little bit of duplicity or irony. The title tells you to sleep, but the context of the event tells you the opposite, that you're supposed to stay awake and listen. The title encourages you to get some shut-eye, but maybe it doesn't really mean it. I want this to serve as a hopefully benign example of something much more insidious, something to which we need to remain alert. After all, we are often confronted with messages about sleep that are indeed disingenuous, or at least contradictory and problematic. Messages that both value and invalidate sleep. A key message of my talk is that in a cultural world where sleep is a site of crisis and power, we must notice when we are given contradictory messages about the value of sleep, whether these messages are explicit or implicit, whether they take the form of language or image, design or practice. We must learn to read sleep with great care. We need to develop a critical literacy of sleep in a restless world. For someone like me who studies Canadian literature and culture, all of this raises the question, what's happening with sleep in Canada? Not much work has been done to understand how sleep operates as an intricate and contested figure within this nation. So I've been working to try to understand this question. And I would like to argue that representations of sleep in Canadian texts and in different ways, Indigenous texts can challenge or otherwise bring to critical awareness the cultural functioning of sleep and its configurations of power and thought. Sleeping in Canada is both the same and not the same as sleeping somewhere else. There's nothing unique about the physical process of sleep in Canada, but because sleep is never a purely natural act, but is expressed through cultural forms of meaning and value, sleeping in Canada is shaped within particular social expectations and histories that occur nowhere else. I'm going to start out with 3 examples of how this works and why it's important. Clearing the Plains is James Dashuk's historical study of the Canadian government's brutal use of starvation and disease to control Indigenous populations on the prairies. He notes of the residential school system that as early as the late 19th century and for decades afterward, the link between overcrowded sleeping quarters and tuberculosis within the schools was fully understood. The government knew for decades that the sleeping conditions in the schools would create disease. This means that inadequate sleeping arrangements served in effect as a genocidal tool for the Canadian suppression of Indigenous peoples. The lack of awareness among non-Indigenous Canadians today about the genocidal actions of their own government is a failure of the Canadian education system, and one that is only now being gradually and inconsistently addressed. And that the colonizing society saw fit to force Indigenous children into sleeping quarters guaranteed to contribute to widespread deadly illness is one of many shameful parts of this history. Second, an incident in Thunder Bay, Ontario last year shows how the sleep of Indigenous people continues to be uniquely and aggressively policed. And this incident hints at how sleep can serve as a flashpoint in the context of systemic racism. This was one evening last April. A city transit officer found 2 Indigenous men sleeping on a bench at the City Hall transit terminal. And rather than helping the men or talking with them or allowing them to sleep, the officer pulled out his phone, took pictures of them, and then called over a few other transit officers and a security guard who also started taking photos while pointing and laughing at the sleeping men. An Indigenous mother and her young son who witnessed the incident took to social media to share their dismay at this treatment of the sleeping men, with the wide circulation of the story resulting in public outrage, news media reports, and an investigation by the city. The power dynamic of city officers confronting Indigenous people within the context of systemic colonial racism was compounded here by the power that those who are awake and watching hold over those who are asleep and watched. The vulnerability of sleep enabled the transit operators to carry out racist conduct with apparent impunity while the 2 men were unable to respond or defend themselves. However, the vulnerability of this sleep also became a vital factor in determining that the act would be met with public condemnation rather than indifference. If the 2 men had been awake, they still would have had very little recourse in that moment in terms of their position as racialized subjects confronted by officers of the city. Yet their position of powerlessness became heightened and fully visible by virtue of their sleep. As a clarifying lens for colonial power, sleep facilitated both the racist act and its public denunciation. Going in a different direction, a third example comes from Calgary writer Teresa Wong's 2019 graphic memoir, Dear Scarlet, the story of my postpartum depression. This book gives an illustrated account of Wong's intense struggle with postpartum depression after the birth of her first child. As Wong battles overwhelming hopelessness and feelings of inadequacy, the extreme pain of her depression is compounded by the failures of the social environment that is supposed to support her as a new mother. People that she talks to tend to dismiss her depression. They tell her that she will soon get over the baby blues, and that she should focus on the positive. Continuous sleep deprivation intensifies this agony, and when Wang is occasionally granted short periods of rest, she lies awake, running through a litany of anxious self-doubts, even to the point of thinking that her baby would be better off without her. In one scene, the baby's incessant crying during the night leads Wang to say to her husband, "I think I hate her." To which the husband replies, "She's just a little baby." Wang then writes in a caption above her sleep-deprived self, "He was right. I didn't hate you. I hated myself." This rapid spiral of dark thoughts emphasizes the way that sleep deprivation can so easily be linked to depression and the distortion of judgment, as Wang takes a mere 3 panels to undertake a harrowing sequence from hating her baby to hating herself. This is how the panels appear on the full page in the book. The simplicity and spareness of Wang's line drawings mirror the blunted sense of exhaustion from which she cannot escape, as her psychological world is figuratively drained of detail and color. Although there are 3 people in the bedroom, Wang appears to be completely isolated, except for the brief materialization of her husband when he sleepily speaks a few words. In the final panel of this sequence, Wang's own form is comprised of nearly 13 or so lines of ink, with 2 additional lines serving as blanket and pillow, an intensely bare representation that reflects the desolation and severity of her inner world. This last panel is drawn from an overhead point of view, so it blocks out any possibility of seeing her husband and baby, as her thoughts become fully narrowed on her own self-doubt. The accoutrements of sleep, the blanket and pillow, are so useless that they barely exist, while the bed has disappeared altogether. In other parts of the narrative, Wang's Chinese immigrant elders foster a form of family caregiving that's very different from the mainstream Canadian treatment of new mothers. So Wang notes that, quote, "In Chinese culture, mom and baby are confined to the house for the first month after birth. The mom gets a chance to recover while the grandmother gets quality baby time. It's somewhat great since there's no pressure for new mothers to bounce back quickly, but also somewhat terrible because it can be so isolating." So the intermingling of these different cultural traditions gives Wang the chance to assess their respective value systems. And eventually she finds better support both in and out of the home, but the problems of sleeplessness and depression remain unsolved until an epilogue that traces the later stages of her parenting life. So these 3 examples just scratch the surface when it comes to cultures of sleep in Canada. But what all of them reveal is that sleep as a universal human act cannot be separated from its cultural and political dimensions, and that sleep takes shape in this nation in diverse and inequitable ways. Pierre Trudeau famously said in a different context that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. Yet the values, meanings, and historical legacies that form Canadian cultural life have always intruded into people's most intimate sleeping quarters. The ideologies of the social world are already waiting for you in bed when you climb under the covers, let alone when you lie down on a bench at a transit terminal. And the particular way these ideologies affect you depends in large part on your position within systemic structures of privilege and power. So we can start to understand the implications of the assertion from sociologist Sarah Arbour that where, why, and how we sleep are all sociocultural matters, all historically and culturally contingent. She says that sleep patterns are tied inequitably to gender, income, and other social factors. And we can see why sociologist Simon J. Williams argues that sleep is political through and through. We don't necessarily have to concede that sleep has no existence beyond politics, but if we want to think carefully about sleep or about time, we need to have a politically aware literacy of sleep. Given all of this, it's no wonder that images of sleep, that most harmless of activities, can spark a surprising degree of anger and controversy, and that representations of sleep in cultural texts of all kinds, from mattress ads to experimental poetry, can serve to question and even shape the contested roles that sleep plays within the public realm. Indeed, the cases that I've just discussed all involve a combination of actual sleep and the representation of sleep. We encounter sleep not just as an act, but as an object of discourse, meaning that sleep is part of, not separate from, the ideologies of waking life. Sleep can carry a sense of danger and uncertainty within the public sphere, partly because it is tied culturally to questions of whose voices and whose representations are seen and heard. I'd like to offer another exercise for you now. Please think of a recent time that you saw sleep portrayed in a cultural text. You can see here some examples. There's an image from Squid Game on Netflix, in which the characters sleep very poorly. An image from The Queen's Gambit, in which the protagonist often sleeps under the influence. And here's Robert Harris's novel, The Second Sleep, which uses sleep as a central metaphor. Your chosen text might be a movie, a TV show, a novel, a song, or something else. There are any number of examples that we could think of. Here are a few more, some of which might be familiar too. So please take a moment to choose either one of the texts on the screen or another one that might occur to you. And my question is, how does your chosen text develop meaning through sleep? Does it portray sleep as a literal act or as a symbolic figure? And to what end? Please take a couple of minutes to think it over. And again, I'd be really interested if some of you might share your responses during the discussion time at the end, because I'm sure you've got ideas that would surprise me. And one of the exciting things about this is that the questions we ask can keep expanding. We might ask all kinds of things. How does your text link sleep with other concerns? Does your text use sleep to challenge or to reinforce dominant assumptions of some kind? If sleep is not represented explicitly, how might it arise implicitly? whose sleep matters. As we go about this kind of exercise, part of what we're doing is asking ourselves, what would it look like to build a critical literacy of sleep? I would argue that the skills that emerge from literary analysis and cultural studies are key here because they allow us to see seemingly mundane visions of sleep through fresh eyes. Maybe during this exercise, some of you thought about advertisements for sleep products because those are some of the most frequent representations of sleep that we see in everyday life. And truly, we can learn an awful lot from a mattress ad. One of the most visible homes of sleep as a cultural figure in this nation is Sleep Country Canada, the mattress and bedding supply retailer founded in 1994 and now operating stores across nearly all provinces. Sarah Arbour is among those who have observed that sleep has become a consumer good. And indeed, as is often the case in the sleep product industry, Sleep Country Canada positions itself less as a purveyor of mattresses than of sleep itself, claiming to offer, quote, all things for all sleepers. The company's ticker symbol on the Toronto Stock Exchange is ZZZ. Sleep Country's earlier advertisements were fairly simplistic, featuring co-founder Christine McGee and the company's signature jingle. But their more recent advertising campaigns, which use increasingly polished cinematography, develop a complex series of associations linking mattresses and other sleep products with two central needs or deficiencies presumed to exist in the audience. The first is the need to alleviate the problems that cause sleep loss, and the second is the need to enable daytime productivity. I'm going to ask you to look at an ad with me from 2017 titled "Sleep is for the Strong." I want to argue that while the representation of sleep in this ad seems to critique social acceleration and the culture of overwork, this critique is inevitably compromised by conflicting values, because an emphasis on the importance of good sleep can ironically be said to normalize and even support a culture of exhaustion. I'm just going to see if I can access the chat box, and I'm pasting a YouTube link in the chat box, which you should be able to see there if you open up your chat box. And I'd like you all to click on that now. You'll be taken to YouTube. It's a 30-second ad, so please watch it and then click on Zoom again to meet me back here. Please go ahead. Okay, hopefully everyone's been able to click on Zoom and come back to the Zoom window. So Sleep is for the Strong, as you've seen, is unexpectedly fast-paced for a sleep product ad. Set to upbeat music, the 30-second ad rapidly depicts two frantic days in the life of a young white male corporate office worker who is overwhelmed by the demands of productivity and the fast pace of working life. When he arrives home to find a large box marked Bloom waiting outside his door, the voiceover states, "Sleep is for the weak, they say. No way, sleep is for the strong." And the ad ends with the worker entering a blissful sleep. The ad apparently intends to promote the importance of good sleep, It participates in what Simon J. Williams would call the sleep positive agenda, characterized by a genuine effort to promote and protect sleep. However, this position is somewhat fraught with contradictions. The ambivalence of the ad hinges largely on the fact that it portrays the primary function of sleep as enabling frantic, perhaps pointless work. The worker suffers from exhaustion because his job is unreasonably demanding. He therefore rewards himself with a new mattress that will replenish his energy so he can continue to perform well in his job, thus further exhausting himself. In this way, the ad reflects the assertion by Sarah Arbour and her collaborators that constant busyness has become a status symbol in Western societies, leading to a devaluation of sleep, with the result that sleep tends to be promoted and celebrated only to serve the goal of increasing work efficiency. The prospects of the worker getting more sleep thanks to his new mattress seem somewhat grim, especially since he doesn't have time to get undressed or turn off the lights. After all, his problem in the first place is not that he has an uncomfortable mattress, but that he has, quote, no time for Z's. Similar concerns have often emerged in critical studies of time, where scholars such as Sarah Sharma, this is her book In the Meantime, and Hartmut Rosa with his book Social Acceleration, have noticed that attempts to resist the exhausting fast pace of modern life often have a counterintuitive effect. Yoga classes, for example, may be presented as a way to slow down, to counteract the exhaustion of social acceleration, but by replenishing the energy reserves of the participants, yoga can effectively serve the goal of coping with exhausting work. Slowing down can thus become a strategy of acceleration. Sure enough, as the worker in the Sleep Country ad falls asleep with a very slight smile on his face, he appears ready to jump right back into action, living up to the demands of his workplace without any need to fight for systemic change. The tagline of the ad, which presents the worker as strong, apparently subverts the popular assertion, often used half-jokingly, that sleep is for the weak. While these two statements seemingly take opposite positions, they ultimately reflect a surprisingly compatible vision of sleep and strength. For instance, the notion of strength in the sense of endurance is central to the use of the phrase sleep is for the weak in the genre of semi-ironic motherhood support writing. Several books in this genre use the phrase in their titles, such as Rita Aarons's Sleep is for the Weak, the Best of the Mommy Bloggers. It's a collection of essays by 25 blog writers. And Emily Jane Clark's Sleep is for the Weak, How to Survive When Your Baby Won't Go the Fuck to Sleep. The phrase here takes an ironic tone in the hope that mothers will find humor in their own exhaustion, even while it supports the marketing of the books as parenting aids for women, presenting sleep deprivation as an inevitability that must be endured. The phrase develops a sense of solidarity, and the notion of sleep being for the weak actually serves as an assertion of strength in the face of exhausting cultural labor expectations tied to gender, as the demands of parenting are placed primarily on women. The Sleep Country ad appears to subvert this notion by reclaiming sleep, positioning sleep as a source or characteristic of strength rather than as a luxury that strong people can get by without. However, the fundamental feature of the worker's strength in the ad, the reason he is strong, is not that he sleeps, but rather that he uses sleep effectively to maintain his exhausting work schedule. In other words, sleep is for the strong turns out to enforce the same proposition as sleep is for the weak. Sleep is an activity to be resorted to only insofar as it keeps fueling the merry-go-round of the exhausting frenzy of modern life. The mothers are strong because they can accomplish their work on minimal sleep, and nearly identically, the worker is strong because he gets just enough sleep to be able to maintain his work. The distinction in this instance is primarily one of gender, in that the male office worker is permitted to claim the notion of strength because he holds a job in an important office, while the women in the self-help books, who must simultaneously endure both paid work and parenting, can claim the notion of strength only surreptitiously through their efforts to avoid weakness. Tied up in both of these representations is the neoliberal vision of resilience, in which individuals have a personal responsibility to manage their energy reserves in order to facilitate the culture of exhaustion. One last notable feature of the ad is that for all the frenzied work the employee must do during his long days, the job has no visible purpose. We don't know what the people at this company are meant to accomplish, other than attending meetings and stacking documents. The worker's job is exhausting work for the sake of exhausting work, and his mattress will enable him to keep doing it. This, then, is the ambivalence at the heart of the business of selling sleep. Sleep as a product is both the antidote to and the enabler of the insomniac 24/7 society. Sleep as a commodity can make individual moments within the culture of exhaustion more bearable. However, it is only through imagining sleep differently that the larger culture of exhaustion can truly be challenged. And if we want to imagine sleep differently, if we want to become careful readers of sleep, I would argue that we need to read poetry and fiction. Literature can do two central things for us. It can teach us to see sleep with fresh eyes, to understand and imagine sleep in unexpected ways, revealing the meanings and significance of sleep in diverse contexts. It can also help us develop a critical literacy of sleep by teaching us to notice how sleep operates as a conceptual figure that can push and pull our attention in many directions. Literature can give us bedtime stories, that's true, but it can also foster a sense of alertness, showing us how to identify and, when necessary, escape the dominant cultural visions of sleep that circulate around us. I'm going to look at one work of poetry today, and that is Swiss-Canadian writer Sandra Huber's book, Assembling the Morrow, A Poetics of Sleep. In 2010, Huber held the unusual position of poet in residence at a sleep laboratory at the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Her goal in this position was to figure out how to represent sleep in language. Such a project immediately encounters the question of how we might be able to perceive the world of sleep, what she calls the sleep side, when our notion of perception belongs to waking life. In the essay that opens Assembling the Morrow, she writes, "To meet sleep on its own terms, one should enter not from waking, but from the sleep side." This, she says, is an experiment for the moxie of poetics. Because poetry, more than fiction, can free itself from the constraints of narrative and all of its fussiness with plot, order, and coherence, poetry may be better suited to venturing away from the rationality of waking life. So what would a poetics of sleep look like? Well, Huber argues that the aspiring sleep poet must engage with the sleep laboratory. Sleep as an object of knowledge, and maybe therefore as an experience, was forever changed by the development of electroencephalographic or EEG technology, and the realization that brain activity during sleep can be represented as a chart. It can be written as a chaotic line across the page and categorized into distinct stages of activity. The second half of Assembling the Morrow presents the poetic result of this project, which naturally is incoherent. Using a copy of her own EEG graph as a template or writable vector, Huber wrote non-representational or semi-representational poetry that charts the contours of the EEG, following its peaks and valleys across the page. Excerpts of this poem chart are presented as a series of fold-out pages that extend for 3 feet when fully opened. True to the form of the EEG chart, in which the information presented is both impressively detailed and, to the non-specialist, hopelessly obscure, the written content of Huber's poetry is densely arranged, but nearly impossible to decipher. Many of the words are not words at all, but fragments of words. And even these fragments are usually obscured by further layers of fragments printed on top of one another, as though a child has been playing with a jammed typewriter. In those rare moments when the writing becomes legible, comprehension seems tantalizingly close, but remains stubbornly out of reach. The struggle we must undergo in order to read these lines hints at a deeper struggle happening within the brain. Huber's sleeping mind wants to establish a sense of meaning through language, but she remains unable to string words together, so that the effort to create meaningful syntax is painstaking and tragic. The poetry is exasperating because it almost means something. Herein lies one of the contradictions of Huber's project. The charts of poetry are meant to present a vision of sleep that emerges from the sleep side, yet despite all the electronic equipment, the impressive technologies of the sleep lab, the vectors, the software, the hours at the keyboard, what finally emerges is a form of representation that remains stubbornly tied to the waking world. The EEG is a technological apparatus created by and for the waking mind. And the fragments of words in the EEG poetry are broken bits of waking language. Is the experience of sleep really a shattered version of waking life, where coherent words become fractured words? The collapse of meaningful language suggestively echoes the befoggedness of the threshold of sleep, but the difficulty with this act of translation is that it presents sleep not as its own form, but as a broken, distorted version of wakefulness. This results in the impression that sleep is a struggle, a hopelessly faulty attempt to mimic waking life. Real sleep, though, isn't a struggle. It's the easiest thing in the world. If anything, the book heightens the sense in which sleep is unfathomable. And Huber is very much aware of these contradictions. She uses them and explores them self-consciously. The work is as much a comment on the limits of technology, language, and wakefulness as it is on the experience of sleep. A final question we might pose of Assembling the Morrow has to do with Huber's assertion that a poetics of sleep must emerge from a sleep lab. After all, such an assertion means that the poetry will always be encumbered by the assumptions and limitations of this form, forever seeing the world through EEG-colored glasses. What is gained from Huber's approach, we might say, is not so much an accurate poetic representation of sleep, but rather a painfully earned awareness of the gap between sleep and consciousness. Sleep cannot coexist with consciousness, and therefore it cannot coexist with language. Every step that language tries to take toward the sleep side leaves the sleep side one step away. Assembling the Morrow is what happens when the unstoppable force of language meets the immovable object of sleep. I've got one more exercise for you now. Suppose you wanted to teach other people to develop a critical literacy of sleep. There are many ways you might go about this. You might ask your students to focus on personal sleep reflections, critical sleep theory, pop culture analysis, critical readings of sleep self-help books, readings of literary works that engage with sleep, or other approaches. So if you only had time for one exercise, which approach would you choose and why? Take a moment to think it over. For my own final reading to wrap up this talk today, I'm going to look at one scene from a work of fiction. Fiction tends to work differently from poetry. When sleep, or more usually sleeplessness, appears in narrative fiction, it tends to operate in the service of a particular thematic interest, often to do with forms of inequity or trauma, but sometimes in relation to healing, intimacy, or growth. And these elements reflect diverse contexts and concerns. In his book, Sleep and the Novel, Michael Graney examines the cultural construction of sleep as perceived in works of fiction. He begins with the central assertion that one way in which we invent sleep is by writing about it. Graney comes to see the novel as a notable record of the diverse and contradictory valuations of sleep that have circulated in modern culture. In considering how these concerns operate in Canada, I'd like to give a brief account of the representation of sleep in a novel by an Indigenous writer. The Marrow Thieves, a 2017 dystopian novel by Métis writer Cherie Dimaline, is a dystopian story that won a Governor General's Award and was a Canada Reads contender. In the story, the settler society has collapsed and settlers have lost the ability to dream and have descended into madness. The narrator, Frenchie, a Métis youth, joins a small group of Cree, Métis, and Anishinaabe survivors on the run from government agents who want to harvest their bone marrow, the part of the body that is said to allow for the ability to dream. The theft of dreams is thus the reenactment, or rather the continuation, of the worst atrocities of colonization. Indigenous understandings of the significance of sleep and dreams are diverse, but Indigenous writers such as Leanne Batassamasak Simpson and Willie Ermine have identified important connections between dreaming and the cultural structures of identity, knowledge, and spirit. In a sense, the novel poses a conflict between two different cultural models of sleep and dreams. The survival of Indigenous sleep signifies the survival of the Indigenous worldviews, while the disappearance of settler sleep represents the near extinction of the medical, technological, and Christian worldviews. The Marrow Thieves contains a few scenes in which the Indigenous characters encounter their own troubles with sleep, and I just want to look at one of these scenes. Frenchie's group of 10 people comes across an abandoned tourist hotel called the Four Winds Resort. Here, rather than sleeping as they usually do in a group camp, each character takes a separate room within the hotel. It was strange, Frenchie observes, all of us separated by walls. Soon, Frenchie's love interest, Rose, comes to join him in his bed, but they are interrupted when the child Riri also comes into the room asking to sleep with them. Then their friend Slopper appears, saying, "Move over, French, I can't sleep." When Frenchie wakes up the next morning, Minerva, the elder, is sitting in a chair in the room. Chai Boy and Wob are sleeping on the floor, Mig is leaning against the wall, and Frenchie's feet are trapped under a weight that turned out to be Tree and Jiguan. The comical scene indicates that good sleep for these characters is communal, and that the settler emphasis on individuality, signified by the solitary rooms of the tourist resort, is hostile to the conditions of group togetherness that enable successful slumber. The most mundane elements of the settler world, rooms with walls and doors and separate beds, are designed in a way that makes sleep difficult for the Indigenous characters. The scene ironizes the settler approach to sleep simply through an encounter with architecture. Ultimately, in this novel, the ability of the Indigenous protagonists to continue to sleep and dream is tied to the recovery and renewal of cultural knowledge. So a story that seems to be about the settlers' theft of dreams turns out largely to be about the positive work of strengthening the languages and traditional forms of knowledge that are tied to the ability to sleep well. I'm going to wrap things up in a moment here, and I hope that those of you who chose to sleep through the talk are having pleasant dreams. For those of you who stayed awake, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the topic and your responses to some of the exercises for those of you who might be willing to share. Figuring out the cultural politics of sleep in Canada or elsewhere requires attention to diverse voices, and I hope this talk sparks some ideas. For me, one measure of success for this project would be how well it manages to reflect and understand many different visions of sleep that emerge within Canada, and also how well it serves as an invitation for a greater diversity of people to get involved in critical sleep studies. The study of sleep needs you. Sleep is crucial, enchanting, and inequitable, and it invites the forms of critical literacy fostered within the humanities, where we can engage with sleep as both practice and representation. Every sleep tells a story, and by learning to read with care, we can help each other rest a little easier. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. That was so interesting. None of us will be able to enjoy our Neo-Citron again after that. If you're willing, it would be great if you would entertain some questions. And for those of you interested in asking some questions, it would be great if you would ask your questions with your camera on. If not, that's okay too, because you may just be slumbering, I suppose. Otherwise, you could ask a question in the chat too. And there is one in the chat, which I could read out to you, Paul. This is from Pamela Banting. I'm curious about what those self-help books suggest about baby sleep. Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks for the question, Pamela. It's really good to see you today. Thanks for coming. the main thing they suggest is that individuals can solve problems with babies' sleep, which is a bit dubious. But really, sleep self-help books, I don't want to create the impression that they're no good. They actually can be really genuinely helpful in a lot of different ways. But an issue with sleep self-help books is that they tend to portray sleep really as an individual matter. So sleep loss is an individual problem or an individual failure that you can solve as an individual. And this is really the way that sleep tends to be presented in the media as well. We've probably all seen a lot of stories about sleep in the news over time, and they'll approach sleep from many different angles and perspectives. But the one thing they all seem to agree on is that when it comes to sleep, you're doing it wrong. If you're pregnant and you're sleeping on your back, you might kill your baby. If you're wearing blue light blocking glasses to prepare your brain for sleep, well, it turns out that's useless and you're a fool for wearing those. If you're worrying about insomnia, that's a terrible mistake because that's a surefire cause of insomnia. So there are many different ways we are told that we're sleeping wrong and that we should be using individualistic tips and gadgets to improve our sleep. And again, some of those tips really can be useful. I read a self-help book recently called Say Goodnight to Insomnia. And the guy who wrote it was pretty irritating to me a lot of the time. And yet the tips were actually pretty useful and pretty helpful. So seeing sleep at an individual level can be very useful, but it really has limitations because I think it's important to see sleep as a cultural matter. And that's really where one of the big interventions of critical sleep studies comes in and can play a really important role. And that's why I think it's important to look at how sleep affects people at a cultural level. How can we approach it as a systemic issue, as a cultural issue? So a sleep self-help book will tell you to lower your room temperature and avoid caffeine, especially after lunch, and practice mindfulness exercises. And sure, those can be good things, but I think we can intervene a little bit there and say, well, if we really want to promote good sleep for everybody, there's a lot more we can be doing on a cultural level rather than an individual level. We can be improving social safety nets. Climate change is a big cultural issue that has perhaps under-recognized connections to sleep. When you think about the heat dome, for those of you who might have experienced it last summer, the flooding that happened in BC in the fall, any number of other climate disasters, the number of people who have encountered a sense of mortal dread through personally encountering a climate disaster is growing all the time. And that has real implications for sleep, just like it has implications for anything else we can think of. When there's a flood or a heat dome, your bedroom is no longer immune to the effects of climate change. And so a sleep self-help book might tell you to lower your room temperature. Yeah, that can be helpful, but I think if we want to promote good sleep, we should be fighting climate change like our bedrooms depend on it, because they do. Thanks for the question, Pamela.
I have a question. So I'm from the Caribbean, so sleep here is different than when I sleep at home. Do you do research with people outside of Canada on how their sleep is affected when they emigrate or they go on vacation?
Really interesting question. My area of expertise really is Canadian literature and culture. So critical sleep theory that you might read tends to come from various different places, the UK and the United States especially, and it can be applicable to different contexts. So I'm not the best expert to talk about sleep in every place around the world, but in terms of people immigrating to Canada, it really depends on the context of the person. There was a sociological study that I saw recently where they were looking at migrant workers in Toronto, and these are people living in a very precarious position. They don't know if they might be deported the next day or the day after that or the day after that. And one of the comments that came up was, we feel like we can't even buy a bed because we don't know if we're going to be here for more than another night. But that's just one situation. There would be a lot of different situations for different people. So I guess I'd suggest starting out by looking at some works of theory in critical sleep studies, because they can give some tools, like Simon J. Williams' idea of the sleep positive agenda. He also says that when we talk about sleep, sometimes we take a sleep negative approach where we devalue sleep. Sometimes we take a sleep positive approach where we promote good sleep. Other times we might take a critical reflexive approach where we ask critical questions about how sleep is recognized. Those are his three categories, and those categories can break down. They have their own limitations, but that's one useful starting point for thinking about how we might approach sleep critically. And it's one of the reasons that I really would like to see more people getting involved in critical sleep studies. It's I guess, a new enough field that there aren't really, there's not really too much in the way of scholarly associations, for example, where people can get together from a lot of different fields or disciplines or places to share knowledge about sleep. Diletta De Cristofaro in Italy is running a group called Writing the Sleep Crisis. And that's a really great example. You can find it if you search Writing the Sleep Crisis. They're doing some really cool work to actually bring people together who are studying sleep from different contexts, because that's a big thing that's sort of been missing in critical sleep studies. We need an association, a way to bring people together who have those different perspectives. And that's one of the places where that's happening.
Thanks. I think there's a question in the chat for you from Lisbeth Bick from Bick Vanderpool. She says, a historical image for me was the action of Graham Fagan entering the bedroom of Queen Elizabeth in Buckingham Palace. He was watching Elizabeth sleep.
Yeah, it's a real reversal of power roles there, right? Where the Queen lives within the seat of power, and yet in that moment, the person who's awake and watching holds a form of power over the person who's asleep and being watched. But in that case, of course, it was only a partial thing for a few minutes. I didn't know if there was more that that you wanted to comment on that. Maybe it was just an association. Yeah, thanks.
Well, you could also see it as a political act also. You know, it's like you were talking about cultural differences, because the fact that he was entering the palace was also to discuss inequality in the British society. So in that sense, and also entering, you know, the palace, which is seemed very good and well kept, wasn't kept at all. Guarded. Wasn't guarded at all. So I see it more as political act, which is interesting in relationship with sleep and safety and society difference in the
Yeah, there's a real sense of vulnerability when sleep loses its position as a form of safety or trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also another remark, for example, because Shep was saying in the beginning that we did something with sleep with me, but also, you know, when we showed this piece in Japan, we noticed that people were sleeping everywhere, you know, in public transport. It also has to do with long days and long distances for travel, but it also, for us, it was also a signal of a safe society. So it's safe to sleep in public. You know,
safe and exhausting.
Yeah, and exhausting.
Yeah.
Also in relationship to your
example of the
commercial,
the bad company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sarah Sharma, whose book I mentioned, her book is called In the Meantime. She's got some really interesting comments about public sleeping. She went to the Vancouver Public Library every morning at the time that it was opening over a period of weeks, I think, and just to observe what was going on. And there would be maybe 100 people lined up waiting to get into the library every morning. And a lot of them were people who were homeless and were waiting for the library to open so they could go inside to sleep. Because for people who are homeless, sleeping is almost an illegal activity. You're not supposed to sleep in public. And so the library becomes this kind of ambivalent place where it's meant to be a public service, a public institution, but it's not really meant to be a place for people to sleep. And so the people come in there and they've gained experience learning how to sleep while appearing to do things that they're supposed to do in the library, like sitting with their hand on a computer mouse or sitting behind a stack of books, and they're sound asleep. And the security guards know who the people are, and they know that they're sleeping, but they allow them to sleep as long as it sort of looks like they're working or reading. And yet, on the other hand, she also points out that business commuters are allowed to sleep on the Tokyo subway, for example. If you're wearing a business suit, you're allowed to sleep in public.
Oh.
If you're a person who's homeless, you're not.
True.
Who was the writer of that book? Sorry.
Sarah Sharma, Sharma, and it's called In the Meantime. She's done really amazing work in time studies looking at inequities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, yes. Please. Chigbo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for this compelling talk. I think you touched on several important points that resonated with me a lot, some of which I'm still thinking about, particularly your critical reading of sleep as a cultural and political act. And I really liked your reading of the Malign's, the narratives. But I'm wondering about cultural representations and meanings of sleep or wakefulness that emerge in the context of struggles. And I'm here thinking about notions of wokeness or staying woke, especially in the American context, that emerged in response to the conditions of colonial violence and exploitations and so on. Also giving a history of labeling some racialized peoples as sleeping peoples, who were in a state of slumber while some others were developing and advancing. So I'm wondering what you think about the assumptions of wokeness as a response to colonial notions of sleeping, because a lot of what came out from your talk for me is about good sleep and bad sleep, and the ways in which the meanings of what is good sleep or bad sleep could come from different cultural contexts and considerations. But on the other side of it, I'm thinking about this response to sleeping that is actually seen as a positive thing, to be awake.
Yeah, really thoughtful question. Thank you for that. Yeah, the idea that people should wake up or be woke, sort of in a figurative sense, maybe devalues sleep, that if you're sleeping, that's a metaphor for not having awareness or not taking action against things. So, some scholars would say, well, we shouldn't use that kind of language because it devalues sleep and it portrays sleep as a bad thing. I think it really depends on the context and the intention of what people are trying to do. So I don't think there's necessarily one approach to saying whether that kind of language works or doesn't work. It really depends on the context. There's this really interesting group called the Nap Ministry, which is based in the United States, and it's a group, you can find them on Facebook or other places online, the Nap Ministry, and they promote rest and sleep as a form of resistance against grind culture or the culture of overwork. but it's founded in an anti-racist position, looking at the history of sleep deprivation, um, forced sleep deprivation against Black people in the United States, that there's such a long history going back into slavery of sleep deprivation being used as a weapon of oppression. And the person who runs the NAP ministry says that if we're going to promote sleep and restfulness as a form of resistance, it has to be based within that history, and it has to be connected to anti-racism. It can't just be a matter of promoting sleep without investigating or thinking about the racial politics behind that. So that's one group that I'd encourage people to take a look at.
Thank
I
you.
was, if I may,
Yes.
could you say a little bit more about that in terms of, based on their proposition, how does it work as an act of resistance? How would that be practicalized?
It's a good question. They post a lot of messages and memes online reminding people to question the way that they've internalized grind culture. If you feel pressure to be productive, to perform, there's a sense in which we've internalized the idea that from capitalism, that we have to constantly be working and be productive, and that the way to resist that is to literally to rest and sleep more, not for the purpose of increasing efficiency, but just for the purpose of resting, because that's an important human thing to do. And yet, I think, and maybe this is what you're getting at, that doesn't really answer the question of what can somebody do when they have to work long hours to pay the bills. I don't think that question is necessarily answered. Even though I really like that group and I like what they're doing, I'm not sure that they really have the answer to that question. And I think they're probably aware of that, and that's one of the things they want to take on. But that's one of the places where these interventions have to take on a cultural and systemic and political dimension, because individual responses are not adequate. The time theorist Hartmut Rosa, whose book Social Acceleration I mentioned, he talks about this as well. He says that when we've got a systemic situation that requires acceleration, requires intense busyness and productivity, if an individual or even an individual organization tries to resist that, they're probably going to pay a price, because they'll be falling behind, to use that metaphor, and they'll pay a price in terms of whether it's employment or income or other costs. And so individual resistance is difficult and problematic, even though it is important, but resistance needs to happen at a larger systemic and cultural level as well. And of course, just like any big changes, it's a very difficult, very complex thing.
Cynthia has a question. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk, Paul. I'm not turning my video on because in my house we're all competing for Zoom rooms. I've got two daughters in university and another one in high school, and they're all doing online classes. So I'm in the storage room, and I don't want to show what the room I'm sitting in. But yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. I've been thinking a lot about sleep. And one thing that I'm wondering about is dreaming. I was kind of surprised that you didn't talk too much about dreaming, except in terms of the Marrow Thieves briefly. But I was thinking that, one of the things we hear about in terms of, insomniacs is that, there's the exhaustion and all of that, but there's also what a common complaint is people don't dream anymore, right? They don't go into REM sleep and get enough dream time. So I was wondering if you've thought about that. And I was thinking about your reading of Huber's poetry, which I had not seen before, so I'm really glad to see that. But you said at one point that sleep, on the sleep side, it doesn't use language, but of course dreams use language in images, right? So I'm wondering how one, I'm just wondering if you've thought about that, and how we think about that kind of, um, you know, craving for dream time, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. You could tell people that your camera is turned on and that it's just really dark in there.
It is dark in here, actually. But I'm not sleeping, I'm awake.
In a way, I've kind of made a conscious decision not to focus too much on dreams because I want to focus specifically on sleep. I know that's not a completely viable distinction because sleep and dreams are kind of inevitably tied together. But I've sort of noticed a deficit of thinking about sleep, at least in my sort of area of Canadian literature and culture. And so I really wanted to try my best to focus on sleep without getting into too many, what I almost see as tangents about dreams. And that's not to downplay the importance of talking about dreams. That's just sort of a personal focus choice that I've made. But dreams are inevitable to talk about in certain ways. One of the interesting things about sleep that was new to me that I learned when I started getting into critical sleep studies is that sleep doesn't necessarily happen throughout the entire brain in the same way. Sandra Huber actually talks about this in that book. Different parts of the brain might fall asleep at different moments or in different ways. And this is one of the reasons that people who are attached to an EEG machine often disagree with the scientists about when they were sleeping and when they were awake. Part of that might have to do with the fact that there are different stages of sleep. The first stage of sleep is one that's such a light sleep that if someone comes up to you and says, "Are you sleeping?" you would say, "No, I'm awake," even though an EEG scientist would say that you were in stage 1 sleep. But there might be different parts of our brain that are asleep at different moments. And so that's a little crack in the door where consciousness and language can perhaps access sleep in a certain form. So that might be a way where language can work its way, or consciousness can work its way into sleep in a way that's distinct from dreams. But it sounds like you're working on this too, and I don't know if now is the time for it, but I'd be really curious to hear about the work you're doing. Thanks for the question, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you. I'm going for sleep therapy, as Pamela knows. So that's why I'm interested in it. But yeah.
Okay.
Paul, there's 2 questions in the chat. Perhaps you'll entertain those, and may I read them? This
Sure.
is from Golnaz Jamshidi. She says, "Thanks for the amazing talk. In some social media, especially TikTok, bloggers use some pranks to disrupt others' sleep to get more views. How do you approach sleep disruption?"
I'm not on TikTok. I haven't seen these pranks. I guess I better look into it. It probably depends on the attitude of the person. Sleep disruption really depends on the context, right? It might be something that happens within families out of a form of caregiving. People who are parents have gone through a lot of sleep disruption, but to great benefit as parents, right? And then at the other extreme example, sleep deprivation has been a key form of domination within slavery. There's an entire spectrum of sleep disruption, so I don't think that's just one thing. Maybe you could share with me some of what these TikTok people have been doing. I don't know how mean-spirited it is, or whether the sleepers have consented to it or not.
Thanks, Paul. There's one other chat question from Melanie Dennis Unrau, if Golnaz is not going to.
I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Yeah, that's fine. Melanie says, "Thanks for the engaging and thought-provoking talk. I'm really interested in what I think I heard you saying about sleep as a reproductive labor. there are resonances with Jacques Rancière's Proletarian Nights, as well as the talk yesterday about negative accumulation and Dimeline, and the idea that sleep is not for the weak or the strong, but for the bosses. Thoughts about that?
There's a lot going on there, and I'm not sure, Melanie, if there's a particular aspect of that that you'd like me to get into. I don't know. Are you willing to share any more about that, Melanie?
Melanie?
You were already talking about this as I was typing a little bit, but
Thanks, Melanie.
you just think that's where you were heading with the discussion of sleep being for the strong or the weak, into a consideration of the role that sleep plays in the reproduction of the workforce, right? So yesterday, when Denise was talking about time being the factor in slavery as negative accumulation, the consideration that you sleep on the clock in a way as an enslaved person, or perhaps also as a worker, is just interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that it's problematic to approach sleep as an individual matter, or sleep loss as an individual failure, because it is tied up so much with structures of power. And the pandemic has illuminated that in some really important ways, where yes, the pandemic has probably disrupted sleep in some way for just about everybody, but it hasn't been the same for everybody. It's been very, very inequitable. There was a study where nurses wore monitoring devices on their wrists over a period of weeks, and it found that nurses tend to work a few days on and then have a few days off, and the body stress response that taxes the heart and prevents the deep sleep that heals the body continued even several days into the time that the nurses had off work. Just a moving example of how sleep troubles can be tied to systemic forces and to working conditions. I mean, to have several days off work and still have that damaging body stress response active is frightening. And it makes me think about doctors as well. There's a suicide crisis among doctors that's been studied, and sleep deprivation has been shown to play a link there. Doctors will commit suicide because they're so sleep deprived in their long shifts that they're worried that they'll make a mistake and harm a patient. There's a lot more to say about the pandemic and the way it's impacted people inequitably. There have been Twitter hashtags about COVID nightmares and pandemic dreams. And studies in earthquakes have shown that people closest to the epicenter of the earthquake have the most trauma that comes out in certain ways, like insomnia or PTSD symptoms. And some studies have found that sort of thing has been happening as well with COVID, that the people who have the closest encounters with the devastation of the pandemic have the most disrupted sleep and the worst insomnia symptoms. There's a lot we could talk about there, but yeah, really, thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Paul. If there's one more question, perhaps you'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful talk, everyone's excellent questions, and you all for coming. Thank you very much.